Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and it is really a privilege and an honor for me to have this special live stream with a dear brother in the Lord and also a professor at my own beloved college, Dr. Bernie Power. And some of you probably have watched him on Dr. J. Smith. He has him as a guest, and he has his own also teachings. So I'm hoping that you will find his presentation today to be extremely beneficial, especially if you have interest, of course, in Quranic manuscripts. Wonderful. Dr. Power, why don't you give people just a brief overview about your background?
I've been involved in the area working with Muslims for about 45 years now, and lived and worked in many different countries throughout Asia and the Middle East. And while I was there, I got the opportunity to connect with Muslims and to learn what they were thinking. And then after I returned to Australia about 15 years ago, took up a teaching job at the Melbourne School of Theology, where I teach on Islamic studies.
Wonderful. What is it that we are going to talk about today?
So on Saturday afternoon, I was out in the streets of Melbourne, where we go every Saturday to talk to Muslims, and had three young men, two from Lebanon, one from Egypt. And when we talked about the Qur'an, they said, there's only ever been one Qur'an. It's never been changed. And I said, I don't think that's right. So I'll be responding to that issue today. Has the Qur'an ever been changed? So this is the claim that the one version came from Muhammad. It was written down, and then that universally accepted text has been recorded and passed on. And so what we have today is exactly what Muhammad, as Muslims claim, heard from Gabriel. This is a booklet on Islam from Abu Dhabi. It says no other book can match the Quran. Not even a dot has been changed. No variation of text can be found. You even go to different parts of the world. So wherever you go around the world, you can find exactly the same Quran. And I decided I would test this. I've lived in a whole lot of Muslim countries, those places with red dots. I've visited them, taught in them, lived in them for over 21 years. And in each place, I would go to a local bookshop and say, can I have a copy of the Quran? And I bought them, and this is the result. I've got 24 different Arabic Qurans, so each one of them is different. With a group of friends and I, over the last couple of years, we've been going through them, collating all the differences. Every one of those little tags there means this is different from the Hafs version. This one is the Ibn Amr version. This one is Abu Ja'far. This one is Warsh version. So every single one of those stickers indicates a place where it differs significantly. Now, we haven't put in every single difference because some of them are just vowel differences that don't affect the meaning. Those differences were all differences of meaning, where one Quran said something, another Quran said something else.
What we're saying here, the meaning itself is different from one to the other. That means the interpretation of it also can vary.
That must. If you've got a different word there, then you have to have a different way of understanding why that word is there. And this wasn't a new problem. It's not something that's recent. It actually existed from the very beginning of Islam. When Muhammad died, there was no authorized written Quran. There were oral versions, and some people had some parts written. But as Islam spread, then in different parts of the Muslim world, different Qurans developed. So you can see up there in the top left-hand corner, Ubay ibn Ka'b in Damascus, his Quran had 116 chapters. He had a couple of other chapters that are not in today's Qurans. To the right, Abdullah ibn Masud had 111. He didn't believe that Al-Fatiha and the last two chapters, surahs 113, 140, were part of the Quran. Down in Medina, we had two versions, 114 or 113 chapters. And there were other written versions around these ones, but these were the ones which were being read and recited in the mosques.
If you don't mind me adding some commentaries every now and then, I want to remind people that Ubay and Ibn Masud, according to the hadith teachings, that they were the two that Muhammad always told people to go to them if he wants to learn the Quran. And the idea, according to the standard Islamic narrative, they were two of his scribes. In other words, he would receive something, and at some point, almost maybe instantaneously or within hours or days, that they will hear it from him, and they took the time to write it down. How can they have different number of chapters.
When this story went back to Uthman, he commissioned a committee of 4 people and he said, write a Quran, one for me from all the versions that are there, and then burn the rest of them. So they were to be destroyed. Now, there were 2 problems with the version that they eventually produced. The first one was the Arabic script at that time had no dots or vowels. Al, can you read that bottom text?
I mean, I can see the word wahal, I can see the word Musa, so because I'm an Arab speaker, I can make some words, but technically speaking, you have to be very careful when you're looking at it and making sure that you are reading it appropriately. But sadly, of course, many times you end up reading it according to today's reading rather than let the text itself speak to you.
Exactly, yeah. That's what people have done. They've taken those texts and they've put in the dots and the vowels, and then the text becomes readable. So the text that's there in the orange and white, you can read that quite easily with no difficulty.
That's right.
Yeah, in fact, a 5-year-old Arab child could read those. And the issue is the structure of the words in Arabic. So you'll have a rasam, which is the basic consonantal shape, which is what was in Uthman's version. They also have the ijam, which is the dots, which distinguish the consonants, and then the harakat, which is the vowels. In the Arabic alphabet with 28 letters, only 7 of them are unambiguous. The other 21 are ambiguous because it could be another letter. And so when you're writing a text without dots, then it becomes unclear which way to go. In fact, you could get a word like this with no dots or vowels, and then put those vowels and dots in, and come up with 30 different words. So this is out of the same consonantal structure, which is what Uthman's Qur'an had. So he would have the text with no dots, no vowels, and it will change the meaning. So you can see in the red box, you're not sure what the person did. Did they repent? Did they destroy? Did they represent? Or who did it? Was it me or you or he or that we or they? This one, it's got a noun in there. If you left this to your friend in a will, did you leave him your pipe, your house, or your daughter? Dots are really important. And again, what the person did, if you say, my wife did this to the house, did she destroy it or did she build it? So it's exactly the same rasam or the same skeleton, but you put the dots and the vowels in different places and you get completely opposite meanings. Uthman's defective text actually had some problems for the people who were reading it. There was a man called Abu Zayd Umar al-Lakhmi who was reading the Quran, and instead of reading in Surah 2, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, he read ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ لَا زَيْتَ فِيهِ. That is the book with no olive oil in it. And so they then nicknamed him Abu Zayd and laughed at him every time he picked up the Quran. Luckily, they didn't have kebabs at that time. Otherwise, he could have read ذَلِكَ الْكَبَابِ لَا زَيْتَ فِيهِ. But both of them are legitimate readings from exactly the same undotted text. When we lived in Oman, they had some men around there who were called mukhannats, who were transsexuals, and they were out in the streets. They were quite open there. They would wear pink dashes and walk around. Anyway, one of them was in the court of al-Mutawakkil and was asked to read from Surah 22. The verse said, وَبَشِرْ الْمُخْبِتِينَ, and he read it, وَالْبَشِرْ الْمُخَنَّثِينَ. So instead of give good news to the humble people, he says give good news to the transsexuals. And again, the text is exactly the same. Without the dots, both of those would be legitimate readings. There is this story, and the guys brought this up to me the other day, saying, oh, well, Allah gave permission to Muhammad to his people to recite the Quran in 7 ahruf. And you've got here this one from Sahih Muslim. It's also in Tirmidhi. He said, Allah has commanded you to recite the Quran to your people in 7 ahruf, and in whichever harf they recite, they would be right. Now, this is great, except we don't really know what the word harf or ahruf means. We know what it means in modern day things. It's like a letter in an alphabet or the edge of something. But what does it mean to read or recite the Quran in 7 letters or 7 edges? And over the years, different scholars have put together possible meanings, come up with somewhere between 35 to 40 possible meanings of this word when it relates to the Quran. In normal speech, it's no problem. We know what that means. At a later stage, Ubay ibn Abbas and al-Azhari and Ibn Athir said, well, it means 7 dialects, the dialects of the Arabs. And we know that the Arabs at that time did speak different dialects, and so they were allowed to speak, according to this view, the Arabic in the Qur'an in 7 different dialects. Next
Yeah.
one.
Yet you have someone like Marian Van Putten who would argue with you that it doesn't mean dialect because he just has his own idea of what it means.
Yes, in fact, I'll quote from him later on. Yeah. But a later scholar, Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, an important scholar, one of the authors of Jalalain, the commentary, he said, because of the growing disagreement, because people were reciting it in their own dialects, Uthman decided that he would destroy all the dialects that disagreed with the Quraysh dialect. And so in his view, all of those other dialects disappeared in 650 AD when Uthman authorized. So that's no longer an issue because they've all been destroyed and there's only the Qurayshi dialect. So no longer can people say, well, we recited in the 7 ahruf meaning dialects, because the dialects still exist, but the Qurans that were written in those languages were destroyed, according to as-Suyuti. Others might disagree, but this would be a common thing. That was why it was necessary to destroy these other versions. The second problem, besides the fact that we're not sure what the word ahruf means, was Uthman's codices actually had mistakes in them. And when he was shown his first copy, he said, I can see there are grammatical errors in it, and the Arabs will read it correctly with their tongues. Aisha talked about grammatical errors, and other types of grammatical errors were there. So they picked up the versions that were written down by the scribes from Zayd bin Thabit and the others actually had mistakes in them from the very beginning.
Yeah, so you wonder really what was the intent behind the project itself during Uthman, if that tradition is accurate, or at least the dating is accurate. Was it to preserve the reading, or was it just to make sure that a certain approved reading according to Uthman is the one that needs to be standardized, yet they were still competing other versions of it? I mean, you kind of like wonder what was the intent behind it.
Yes, yeah, certainly he wanted to impose his authority and make sure that the version that he was happy with had mistakes, but also they had differences in them. We assume, according to this version, 4 or sent out to 4 places, to Medina, Kufa, Basra, and Damascus. We'll test that theory later on. And scholars, so guys like Ibn Ubaid in his book Fadail al-Qur'an, notes that there were 60 variants of full consonants. So remember, this didn't have any dots in it. It didn't have any vowels in it. These 60 variants were found in the defective, in the undotted, unvoweled text. So when they went out to different places, the 4 cities were not receiving the same Qur'an. They were receiving different versions. This is a comment from Dr. Shadi Nasser from Harvard University. He says, the Quran was never a static corpus that remained unchanged since its revelation and inception, due to the scrupulous editing and revisions of the Quran that underwent in its recited oral form through 1400-year journey towards a final static and systemized text. And he says these variants arose because of the defective consonantal outline of the early codices, and we've looked at that. Remove the dots and you can put in almost any word you want. Due to the faulty memory and intentional manipulation of the voweling of the text to serve legal and theological argument. And so particularly amongst the Shia and the Sunnis, even at that stage, they were disputing where the vowels and dots should go. And it says, and the Prophet did acknowledge variant readings during his lifetime and accepted multiple readings of the same verse. So for the early Muslims, it wasn't a problem that you were getting variations in the text, because Muhammad had said this. They could see there was fighting going on amongst the Muslims, and they knew that the earliest text was capable of variant readings.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up, by the way, because indeed my findings, and hopefully the findings of many who are focused on early Quranic manuscripts, is that the early Muslims and early Muslim scholars per se really were not that dogmatic compared to what we see today. They were flexible. They had no problem with some of the variations. Sometimes they even thought it was suitable for this region over that region. But yet today, of course, it's a taboo to go that far and try to make these assertions.
Over the centuries, Muslims started adding in the dots and the vowels and markings, but unfortunately they put them in different places. So there had been this history of people reciting the Quran in different ways. And so some like Abdullah ibn Masud, so they put them in according to his recital. Others like Abu Musa, so they put them in according to his. The list of scholars, Al-Nadim, Ibn Jazari, was saying that by about 900 AD, a huge corpus of variant readings and system readings, at least 50 of them, were circulating amongst the Muslims. So Uthman's plan to have only one Quran wasn't working. People were putting the dots and the vowels in different places. And so you've got 50, Shadi Nasser says maybe up to 75 were around at that time. So this massive explosion of numbers of the Qurans. So this was the first attempt to deal with that. So the early Muslims, as we mentioned before, they accepted these. They weren't too fussed. There were different interpretations. Some said it was a scribal error. Some said it was divine providence. And sometimes you'll hear this argument, oh yes, they're because God wants us to have different perspectives on a word, so he provides different words. But people had no problem with the fact that these were around in that early couple of centuries. They realized that the Arabic grammar rules were different in different places. There were different dialects. The script was not settled. So they didn't question these discrepancies that were in there. They argued about them, and some said, oh, my version is better than yours, but they accepted the existence of all of these. Until a man named Ibn Mujahid came along, and he said, look, this is getting out of control. We need to limit this. And he chose the number 7. Shadi Nasser says it doesn't look like it was related to the 7 ahruf, because by this time people thought the variant dialects had all been destroyed during the time of Uthman. So there was only the one.
Right.
But Ibn Mujahid actually had some political support. The Baghdadi wazir Ibn Muqla was on his side, and so he was able to use political pressure to get his view put out there. It wasn't just as a scholar, but also as a politician and a lobbyist, he did that.
That's right. And his selection was based on popularity, not anything else. Like, for instance, the one from Damascus or the one from Basra or Mecca. And then when it came to Kufa, he struggled and he ended up selecting 3 as a result of the fact that he couldn't find anyone that is more popular than the other.
The first question, why would he produce 7? Well, it wasn't because Uthman sent out 7 mushafs from Medina. If we look at this, we can see the number of different manuscripts that were sent out according to these different scholars. That's them down the bottom. Could be either 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, or an unspecified number, depending on which tradition you read. It's not clear that Uthman got 4 printed. So again, a lot of these are pretty early. So you see the Ibrahim an-Nakhai in 714, Anas ibn Malik in 712, Ibn Jubair in 714. A lot of these who were only within, say, 70 years of it were reporting different numbers of manuscripts that had been sent out. And these were the 7, as I mentioned. So it was Medina, Mecca, Basra, and Damascus. These were the most common ones. And then in Kufa, he had the 3 because there was no consensus amongst the people of Kufa. Some liked Asim for one reason, some liked Hamza for another, some liked El-Kisai. But notice that these had all died 130 to 200 years before Ibn Mujahid. These weren't people that he knew. These were people from a previous age. And he was saying, these are the texts that I'm going to canonize. And just another note, look at the ages of the people. They were all relatively older. So 68 was a young person, but people were in their 70s, 80s, even 90s. Ibn Shanabuth had advocated for the readings of Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b and recited them in public and argued he was in possession of sound chains of transmission. But Ibn Mujahid brought him to trial, after which he was flogged, forced to repent, and pledged thereafter he would adhere to the rasm of the Uthmanic Codex. He was stripped, flogged, put on a breaking wheel, a Catherine wheel, tortured until he recanted and stated he would read only one of the 7. This was how Ibn Mujahid used his power. By the way, Abdullah ibn Masud, the same thing had happened to him. When Uthman told people who had other variants they needed to hand them over, Ibn Masud refused. So Uthman had him brought down to Medina, and then they got beaten up, put in house arrest, eventually died. Before that, his pension was stopped, so he lived in poverty because he wouldn't obey the command of the caliph. So again, it's happening now 300 years later. So here's Shadi Nasser's, just to give us a perspective. So we can see when Muhammad dies, there's no authorized accepted Qur'an. There's some partially written versions, some oral versions that are passing around. And then 24 years later, Uthman says, okay, let's codify it. And then over the next 280 years, we see these 50 to 75 Qurans developing. So Ibn Mujahid comes along and says, no, we're only going to accept 7 of them. So this is the second canonization.
I like the work of Dr. Nasser because he's really a brilliant scholar, and all he's doing is laying out the facts and letting you judge it based on that.
He points out that there was also contamination from the hadith method. So the hadith, people had been collating the hadith, and so he then applies those rules to the Qur'an. So the ideas of the terminology, the moral transmission of the transmitters, corroboration, weren't in existence when the Qira'at, or the earliest versions, these 7 versions, were written. But now he's saying, well, we need to apply those methods to these to make sure that these are acceptable as well, which was a completely new thought. A couple of words. So you might come across this word eponymous readings, which means a book that's named according to its author. So Hafs is the one that Hafs wrote. A qira'ah is a reading written between 90 and 170 years after Muhammad died. And a reader is a qari, or a qura. And then the riwayah is a transmission or recitation which came after that and came from it. And the transmitter is called a rawi, or the plural is a ruwah. So that you'll see those terms popping up. So the isnads, he says, were actively connected through fictitious narratives and isnads to their mythical founders, which is a pretty big claim. He says the process of isnad documentation was not utilized at the generation of the 7 readers. These things were added later, and as time went on, he says they became more and more sophisticated and more detailed, even though at the time that wasn't done.
Yeah. And if I may add something related to this, like, for instance, he's talking about the idea that it's retroactive here in terms of the chain of the narration itself. When you look at some of the corrections that were made to the early Quranic manuscripts that were discovered by Dr. Brubaker, he would argue also that those appear to be retroactive in terms of like fixing an earlier Quranic reading to match today's Quran.
Yeah, and it's very clear. You can see where they've crossed out words which didn't agree and written in a word which did. So this idea of attestation, so mutawatir, a text, is one which has multiple lines of transmission which were independent. In other words, the people weren't talking with someone else about what they had. That's the best one, where you can get independent evidence from witnesses who haven't colluded together. But he says the fact remains that all of the eponymous readers were transmitted via single strands of transmissions between the prophet and the 7 readers. And this is the least reliable form of transmission. So he said, based on the evidence that we have, there wasn't multiple attestation happening through there. If you wanted to apply those rules of integrity, Asim doesn't quite make it. His contemporaries and those shortly after him said he made many mistakes, he had a bad memory, and he used to pass on bad hadith versions, things that had weak narrators and that contradicted well-known authentic hadiths. So they would reject him as a transmitter of the hadith, but accept him as a transmitter of the Qur'an, which seems a little bit anomalous to me. And there were also character issues. So hadith transmitters had to have a certain character, a good character. And El-Kisai was known to be a liar. He was impudent, consumed alcohol, accompanied young boys. And one day when reading in the mosque, he got beaten up by the congregation because he was reading an unacceptable reading, one of Hamza, which is actually one of the 7. It became acceptable from Ibn Mujahid's perspective, but it wasn't at that time. So there were issues about his character. So Adani and Ashatabi came a couple of 100 years later, and they said 7 is too few. We need to be more accepting, inclusive, and so they added 2 to each of those. And you can see now these are the reciters. So they came later. Again, have a look at the dates of their death. Half of them were aged above 89. Now you might wonder, why would they need this? Because if you want to construct a chain of transmission, you have to have people going back as far as they can. And so their birth dates became very elastic. And I would imagine that these ages, not many, you wouldn't get half the population living over 90, actually it is. And so we're seeing this kind of stretching of the birth dates as well as the biographies of these people. Another thing is that Aduri transmitted two versions. So he heard one from Ibn Amr and he also heard one from Al-Kisai. And I've got versions of both of these, by the way, and they're different, which is a problem. If you went to Aduri and said, recite the Qur'an to me, he'd say, well, which one do you want? Do you want the one from Abu Amr that I heard, or do you want the one from Al-Kisai? Or do you want my version of Abu Amr because his is different? Or do you want my version of Al-Kisai because his again is different? There's variations between every single one of them. So I said, I can give you 4 versions. Which one do you want?
This is really the sad state of affair, brother, here. I accept these kind of attestations from the normal Muslim on the street, the normal guy on the street, the normal Muslim woman, who really wholeheartedly believe in this. But you have scholars who are actually have no problem with this, and they will go to fight actually in a battle to try to prove that, yes, what you just said is possible for Al-Duri to do all of that.
Okay, so even within these versions, there's not a single version of Hafs. He says Asim's students disagreed amongst one another and transmitted his reading in different forms, and the rendition of both Hafs and Shu'bah, who both heard the reading from Asim, were different. And again, I've got both of these and I've collated the differences between these two. So you've got two guys who may be even sitting in the same room listening to their reader, and they're either learning or writing down different versions of it, which is a problem. So Ibn Mujahid, he didn't have actually a copy of Asim or even a copy of Hafs, so he couldn't canonize that copy. What he had was different versions that had been passed down to him, and he had to choose which one of these versions he was going to accept. So it wasn't a sense of he's just this one thing, but multiple versions that have been passed down, and every one of them is different. It's not, they're not identical. Otherwise, they wouldn't have kept them.
Yeah, and Dr. Shadi Hikmat Nasser goes through a lot of these basically diagrams in his book.
It's very meticulous. He goes through word by word with some of them and talks about the different ones. So now we've got to what he calls the third canonization. It looks like about a quarter of a millennium seems to be the going time when the Quran comes up for a review. We've now got 21 Qurans. We've got the 7 that Ibn Mujahid said, and then the 14 that Adani and the Shatibi after him said. So that makes 21. And then a Jazari comes along and he says, well, 7 and the 14 is not really enough. We need to have these other ones in. So he adds in, and again, these were all from the same period. It's not as though he's adding in a Quran that was written 200 years later, but they're all from the same period. So he adds in Abu Ja'far and Yaqub and Khalaf. Again, I've got copies of these with their reciters. And here they're being a little bit more agnostic about the age at death. So now we've got to the 4th, and now we've got again, so we've got the same period with 237 to 377 years later, another quarter of millennium. He's now saying, well, there are 30. And what they're doing is authorizing the ones which can be read in public. People still had their private versions that they'd been passed on, or people were writing about other things which had been ignored in the earlier centuries. So he's now pushing for these ones.
This is like almost 800 years later after the time of Muhammad.
And then Dimyati comes along. His are not quite as strongly attested or strongly affirmed, and some Muslims will have problems with this, but you do have copies of this, and this has got the 14 different versions in there, which includes those ones in there. So Hassan and Ibn Muhaysin and Yazidi are included in this, and again they list all of the different variations. So they'll have a verse there in the text. This would be the Hafs version inside the box, and then all the different variations of it from these other 14 readers. So that's the 5th canonization. This isn't Shadi Hikmat Nasser. He doesn't put this one in there. He actually adds another one instead. But I thought it was important to put this in, particularly because for many people, these are acceptable ones. And again, you can see the timelines there in the green: 280, 257, 337, 275. Every quarter of a millennium, they decide it's time for a change. Okay, next
Yeah,
one.
so basically what they're doing is, like you said, I like what you said. It's time to review the Quranic edition and make corrections now because, this really looks like it's not clear to people anymore. So we have to fix the problem. I like what Marian is saying here. She's saying it's also, okay, Marian, we're not going to say the word, but it's also interesting, let's say, that the further they move, meaning that our Muslim friends move forward in time, in this case, like you have the second canonization or the third canonization or the fourth canonization, the more trustworthy reciters they are able to dig up from the past and shoehorn into their chains of narration. I mean, it's really interesting and fascinating to me indeed. If we were to do half of this just for the gospel, you will be surprised how many Muslims are going to attack us for daring to say that it's reliable. Dr. Power, how can people who are watching this show now, and hopefully the future one, how can they benefit in terms of their witness to our Muslim friends? That's my first question.
I carry these things on my phone. So when people say, no, it's not possible that there could be difference, I'd say, well, look, have a look at this. Here's my picture of 24 different Qur'ans that I own. And these are some of the differences between them. And people, I mean, if they don't want to believe, they're not going to believe anything, but others will be a little bit more open and say, oh, look, I'll be happy to go and have a look at that. The other thing is I did a debate a couple of years ago with a scholar from Australia on has the Quran been changed? And I put some of this earlier material, not this stuff that I've been doing now, or the stuff that I'll do next time, into that. So that gives people a bit of a background, and I'll send that out to them so that they can see that there's a reasonable basis for this from an Islamic perspective.
Wonderful. And also, if you tried it already with some, have you noticed any reaction?
Typically, they'll say, oh, I need to go and talk to my imam about this.
Of
And I
course,
say,
of
you do
course.
that. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I can summarize what we've talked about today. We've recognized that many versions of the Quran existed from the very beginning. It wasn't something that was a surprise that popped up in the 2nd century. Muhammad had talked about these 7 ahruf, but nobody actually knows what he means by it. And 35 to 40 different explanations have been suggested for it, but nobody's really clear. Uthman decided he would enforce one version, but it was undotted. And also the versions that he sent out were different from each other, so it wasn't consistent. And so we had the result of 50 to 75 different versions appearing by about 900 AD. There were multiple versions you can choose from. Ibn Mujahid says, let's limit it to 7. Adani and Shatabi add in the qira'ats, another 14. Ibn Jazri adds in the 3 to make it up to 10. Then Dimyati adds another 4. So we're now seeing the number increase and increase. And then we'll see next time what the Muslim world decides to do about this and what the differences are between them.
Wonderful. Again, if you can just, before we close, let people know the type of work that you do. And do you, by the way, have your own YouTube channel, or do you
Yes,
have
I do. Yeah. So just berniepower.com, and I've got my own website as well. So people
And
can
do you
go.
talk about these issues in there?
Yes. Yeah. So if you go onto the debates one, you can see the.
Dr. Power, we are so thankful for wonderful scholars like you. And we pray that the Lord will continue to use you in a powerful way to reveal many of these things to you so that many will benefit, and especially Muslims, from these findings, and they will find the truth in the Son of God, and knowing the Son will set them free. And that's what we pray for. Thank you, our dear brother. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I promise you there'll be part 2. And right now, after the show, I will discuss with Dr. Power about his availability, and we will continue doing these things because they're extremely powerful, and they're extremely also eye-opener for our Muslim friends. So indeed, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for everything that you do. And thank you.